Today we're looking at a compilation of Mao Zedong's works, on practice and on contradiction. If the name Mao rings a bell, it's probably because he was an unbelievable Chad and led the anti-capitalist revolution of the largest country on the planet, all while revolutionizing the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of Marxism itself, and smoking more than a preteen working a 12-hour shift in the coal mines of Victorian England. Probably one of the most important thinkers of the past 100 years if I had to pick one, so you should probably pay attention.
Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road.
On Contradiction was originally presented in 1937 as lectures given by Mao at the Anti-Japanese Military and Political College, shortly after the previous chapter on Practice. And it was written for the same reason too, to clear up some misconceptions a lot of his comrades had about the way things worked within Marxism. He starts by immediately quoting Lenin, emphasizing that the entire concept of materialist dialectics that we've covered way too much up until now is based on the basic law, or the kernel, of the unity of opposites. That, for those of you who don't speak communist, refers to the pattern of opposites conflicting with each other before coming together into something new. You can think about this in terms of class struggle, slaves v. slave owners in slave society, or you can think about it in terms of the development of political movements, right opportunists versus left idealists, or you can think about it as the yin-yang. All of them follow the same basic pattern. That pattern is the unity of opposites. Mao is specifically concerned with a handful of misconceptions his students often have when he talks about the unity of opposites. The first misconception he calls the two world outlooks. These outlooks are two schools of thought that have shaped the way that philosophy has developed throughout the past few thousand years. One, Mao calls the metaphysical outlook, and the other the dialectical outlook. This already sounds like a lot, but I promise you can handle it. The terms are just crusty as hell. Basically, there are two different ideas about the pattern that the development of society and ideas take throughout time. The dialectical conception, as we literally just talked about, is based on the concept of opposites forming, duking it out for a while, and then eventually coming together again into something new. Dialectics, basically. The metaphysical conception, on the other hand, is something that's probably even more familiar. It's the predictable, linear sort of stages of history kind of development that we all learn in school in the West. First there was one stage, and then the other type beat. Think about that annoying 13-year-old atheist evolution t-shirt that shows monkeys becoming apes and then apes becoming humans. The same sort of thing is applied to history, almost always European history, of course. First there was the Romans, then the Dark Ages, then the Renaissance, then the modern era. There's no thought given to where each of these things came from, how they changed over time, and what caused them to move into the next stage, just one and then the other. The first big difference you might notice between these two outlooks is the way that they approach change. In dialectics, change is not only always taking place, but is mostly internal to whatever is being changed, driven by the struggle between the two opposite internal parts. Again, in class society, the transition from slave society to feudalism is explained as the two main classes fighting each other based on the pursuit of their own incentives, before eventually making a fragile piece called feudalism. But in the metaphysical outlook, causes are external, because it assumes that humans are always the same on the inside. This is the Jordan Peterson, Steven Pinker, Jared Diamond, very unscientific pop history outlook, where slavery was always something that humans saw as inherently unjust, and we just did it for thousands of years because conspicuous silence. Some people fill these blanks with geography, some people fill them with racism, some of them just have a mental breakdown. Whatever it is, the ultimate reason that change happened was because something happened to humans, and we just rolled with the punches. Mao puts it like this: they ascribe the causes of social development to factors external to society, such as geography and climate. They search in an oversimplified way outside a thing for the causes of its development, and they deny the theory of materialist dialectics, which holds that development arises from the contradictions inside a thing. Consequently, they can explain neither the qualitative diversity of things nor the phenomenon of one quality changing into another. Maybe the easiest way to refute this outlook is to look at the class position of those who support it. Usually, especially in China in the 1930s, the most vocal advocates of this mechanical, vulgar, metaphysical outlook are members of the owning classes, who directly profit from people believing in it. Mao continues, simple growth in plants and animals, their quantitative development, is likewise chiefly the result of their internal contradictions. Similarly, social development is due chiefly not to external but to internal causes. Countries with almost the same geographic and climatic conditions display great diversity and unevenness in their development. Moreover, great social changes may take place in one and the same country, although its geography and climate remain unchanged. Imperialist Russia changed into the socialist Soviet Union, and feudal Japan, which had locked its doors against the world, changed into imperialist Japan, although no change occurred in the geography and climate of either country. When put like this, it's plain to see that the dialectical outlook simply has much greater explanatory power, not only in terms of big changes like the change from Imperial Russia to the USSR, but even in much smaller and subtler changes, like the birth of a revolutionary movement within China in the early 1900s. Maybe the most interesting part of the dialectical outlook, though, is that it also allows for external factors to play a role in the development of things, just all the while emphasizing that the actual mechanism of change is internal. As Mao says, dialectical materialism holds that external causes are the condition of change and internal causes are the basis of change, and that external causes become operative through internal causes. In a suitable temperature, an egg changes into a chicken, but no temperature can change stone into a chicken because each has a different basis. Okay, what the hell is he on about here? Stones and chickens. Well, he's saying that yes, external circumstances do influence internal change, but not directly. External circumstances interact with internal circumstances to create the conditions for change, and then that change is actually made internally. I'm not sure if that was any clearer, so let's take a look at an example. World War I certainly played a role in the fall of the Russian Empire, but it wasn't because the war itself killed everyone in Russia that was pro-empire. The war caused many problems for everyday Russians. Food shortages, forced conscription, and increasing obviousness of the divides between the elite and normal people all came up in Russia during the war. And then those normal people acted, rose up, and threw off the yoke of their oppressors. The Russian Revolution didn't happen because of World War I, but World War I certainly made the revolution a lot more doable. Mao even extends this to wars themselves, analyzing a potential military success or defeat primarily through the dialectical lens. One army is victorious because it is strong, unified, and led by a competent general, while another isn't because it is weak, divided, and led by incompetent leaders. It is through internal actors that external circumstances create change. Mao drills down to his own party and analyzes why previous attempts at revolution were unsuccessful. One failure was due to the rise of opportunism within the party, and another was due to the rise of adventurism. In both cases, when these tendencies were liquidated, the revolution regained ground in its struggle. Thus, the success of a revolution depends primarily on the, quote, correctness of its own political line and the solidity of its own organization. Okay, so if the dialectical outlook is so based in Chad, why is the cringe metaphysical outlook so popular? Well, ignoring the material incentives of the people that promote them nowadays, there was a historical reason for it. You see, the dialectical outlook that we've been talking about so far is actually really new in historical terms. There have been dialectical traditions throughout history, be it in Zoroastrianism, early Christian sects, or Taoism, but there was one important difference between those systems of knowledge and the one that Marx presented, materialism. Ancient forms of dialectical thinking, while correct in the broad strokes, weren't materialist, and so they ended up not being rooted in the perception of reality. This was not the case with the metaphysical outlook, which was at least in some sense materialist. This status quo continued all the way through Georg Hegel until Marx and Engels took the strengths of both worldviews, the materialism of the metaphysical outlook and the dialectical process, and synthesized them together into the dialectical materialist outlook. Interestingly, within the development of dialectical materialism, you can easily see the dialectical process at play: thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which brings us to the universality of contradiction. As we've just seen, the dialectical process seems to be found everywhere. Classes in society, philosophical movements, the development of history, whatever. They're all marked by two contradictory opposing forces. That's not the only place you can see these contradictions, though. In math, plus and minus. differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative charges. In chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms. In war, offense and defense, advance and retreat, victory and defeat. All of existence seems to be structured by these same sorts of contradictory forces. And most interestingly, every single thing previously mentioned, as well as probably many more, please drop some examples in the comments to make things clearer for other comrades, all have the same sort of relationship. They're both contradictory, but also interdependent. A battle can't have two victors, but it also can't have a victor and no loser. These sort of relationships Mao calls objective contradictions. These objective contradictions are reflected in individual people's thinking as well, as we can see from the development of dialectical materialism. The push and pull of the objective contradiction inevitably pushes forward the development of ideas, and helps us to answer questions and solve problems within our own minds and without. Of course, objective contradictions also exist within political movements. As we've talked about in my last video, there is always a right wing and a left wing of every movement, and it is the interrelation and struggle between the two that drives the movement forward. Contradiction is universal, but universal not only means that it exists everywhere around us all the time like the Force, it also means that it exists at all times. Let me explain. Okay, so here's a bit of a deep cut for you theory heads out there. Mao uses this opportunity to push back against the Deboran school, a theoretical school in the USSR at the time that would go on to have disastrous consequences. Essentially, Deboran and his supporters argued that class contradictions, like those between workers and capitalists, didn't emerge at the same time that capitalism did. They decided, somehow, that there was a period of capitalism where there was no objective contradiction between workers and capitalists, before that contradiction then later emerged. To give them credit, I think they were trying to explain how class contradictions worsened over time throughout the development of capitalism by deciding based on conspicuous silence that there was a time when they didn't exist. That worsening certainly did happen, and has continued to happen thanks to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but also, to give their critics credit, the concept of capitalism as a system is, at its core, based on the creation of two classes with contradictory material incentives. Workers do work and get paid far too little for it, and owners own and steal money from their workers. That's literally what capitalism is, and that's essentially Mao's point here. Defining capitalism without defining the objective contradiction at its heart is like defining the Grateful Dead without mentioning LSD. Just literally not possible. Mao puts it like this: even under the social conditions existing in the Soviet Union, there is a difference between workers and peasants, and this very difference is a contradiction. Although, unlike the contradiction between labor and capital, it will not become intensified into antagonism or assume the form of class struggle. The workers and the peasants have established a firm alliance in the course of socialist construction, and are gradually resolving this contradiction in the course of the advance from socialism to communism. The question is one of different kinds of contradiction, not of the presence or absence of contradiction. Contradiction is universal and absolute. It is present in the process of development of all things, and permeates every process from beginning to end. And at this point, Mao does the thing that every seasoned communist does as soon as theory is mentioned. He tells you to read Das Kapital. I promise I'm gonna get there someday on this channel. It really is worth it, but that shit is long as hell, and I have a full-time job and something resembling a life. If you want to help speed that process up, consider liking and subscribing and ringing that bell. The reason Mao brings Kapital up is to describe how Marx first described the universality of contradiction. Marx goes through the simplest, most ordinary and basic economic relations of industrial capitalist society, the production and exchange of commodities. In this very zoomed-in tiny microcosm, he describes with painstaking detail the contradictions in every single exchange. The contradiction between the worker and the owner, yes, but also between the buyer and the seller, the investor and the consumer, so on and so forth. He looks with incredible detail at the actual objective contradictions that form the economy around him at that time. In short, he looks at the particularity of contradiction. As we just discussed, contradictions be everywhere, but they also be different in different places. This concept, in Mao's particular dialect of Krusty, is called the particularity of contradiction. Using the universality of contradiction as a lens, Mao evaluates all fields of science to illustrate the differences between types of contradictions: positive and negative numbers in math, action and reaction in mechanics, and so on. Each of them is a contradiction, yes, but they all have different qualities and relationships with each other. Each one is particular, you might say. These particularities, Mao says, are actually the exact places where lines between different disciplines are drawn. Math is the study of contradictions between positives and negatives. Mechanics is the study of action and reaction, etc. In the development of these fields, you'll notice that there is a general sequence that plays out. The objective contradiction is observed in one specific situation, before it is then gradually expanded to cover a general group of situations. This is essentially the scientific method. Evolution was first observed in finches on a couple islands in the South Pacific, and only through decades of gradual expansion, mediated by conducting scientific tests, did it eventually come to apply to all living things. Then, when the general theory has been come to, scientists revisit it in specific situations. Once evolution had become widely accepted by scientists, it was then revisited specifically in the context of human evolution, which helped us advance the scientific theory of evolution from the edgy atheist t-shirt monkey ape person diagram to the current accepted model, referred to as the braided stream model. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but it's fascinating and I highly recommend you watch this video about it at least. It's good shit. What's important about that for our purposes here is that knowledge advanced originally with a pattern from the specific to the general, finches to everything, and then after that in the opposite direction, from the general to the specific, everything to humans. Mao puts it like this: when humanity attains the knowledge of this common essence, they use it as a guide and proceed to study various concrete things, to discover the particular essence of each. Only thus are they able to supplement, enrich, and develop their knowledge of their common essence and prevent such knowledge from withering and petrifying. These are the two processes of cognition, one from the particular to the general, and the other from the general to the particular. Thus, cognition always moves in cycles, and so long as the scientific method is strictly adhered to, each cycle advances human knowledge a step higher, and so makes it more and more profound. At this point, we turn back to the original point of this entire essay, to correct the misconceptions of several of Mao's comrades at the time. Mao here observes that not following the cycle of intellectual development that we just outlined leads to big mistakes. As he says, our dogmatists are lazy bones. They refuse to undertake any painstaking study of concrete things. They regard general truths as emerging out of the void. They turn them into purely abstract, unfathomable formulas, and thereby completely deny and reverse the normal sequence by which one comes to know truth. Nor do they understand the interconnection of the two processes in cognition, from the particular to the general, and then from the general to the particular. They understand nothing of the Marxist theory of knowledge. Get fucked, De Boron, you prideful fool. To avoid getting annihilated by based King Mao like that, we need to study not just the specific situation we're looking at and the generality that's been drawn from that, but also the process of development that led to that situation in the first place. We don't just need to study the contradiction between workers and owners, but also where that contradiction came from historically, and the situation that led to it emerging as it did, how capitalism became feudalism. This is because, basically, different things are different. Mind-blowing, I know. Even if two contradictions look similar from the outside, they can require two different solutions. Let me give you an example. The contradiction between workers and capitalists is resolved through socialist revolution, and the contradiction between capitalists and the class of kings was resolved through liberal revolution. They're both revolutions, and that is an important commonality, but they're also both different kinds of revolution, with different methods, tactics, contexts, and objectives. The American Revolution, in the immortal words of the Descendants, was a revolution where the Chinese Revolution, on the other hand, was won by conducting anti-imperialist protracted people's war against the imperialist powers of the nationalists, all of Europe, Japan, and, you guessed it, the Yanks. This sanding down of differences is one of the biggest issues Mao had with people in his movement at the time. Rather than putting in the effort to actually look deeply into the specific situation, find the contradiction at its heart, and make a plan to resolve it based on what is actually happening, he criticizes them for invariably adopting what they imagine to be an unalterable formula and arbitrarily applying it everywhere, which only causes setbacks to the revolution or makes a sorry mess of what was originally well done. To really understand the core of a contradiction and begin to design a path to resolving that contradiction, one needs to analyze the contradiction to find the two aspects of each contradictory force. Aspects, to Mao, are the different forces that contradict each other, workers v. owners, for example. It's also important to learn which one of the two is dominant, capitalists, in this example. What concrete forms it manifests in, small business owners, corporations, landlords, etc., and the concrete forms in which struggle between the aspects appear, rent, taxes, wage theft, strikes, etc. By finding the answers to these questions, it will become clear how they can be resolved. For example, if we're looking at the contradiction of landlords versus tenants, landlords are obviously the dominant aspect of the contradiction. It manifests in the form of arbitrary, faceless, quote-unquote owners being handed 2/3 of a tenant's paycheck for the use of an apartment that the owner has literally never set foot in, and have only ever interacted with as an abstract number in their financial portfolio. Struggle manifests as rising rents and declining property quality, as the landlord is financially incentivized to resell their investment property for a profit, all while tenants are simply trying to use and maintain property, and actively being prevented from doing so at every turn by their landlords. By looking at the actual relationship between landlords and tenants, it becomes clear that the landlord provides literally nothing of substance to the property. In fact, they actively hinder the productive use of property by using it as a bargaining chip in a speculative shell game on Wall Street. So, the way to resolve the contradiction appears clearly: liquidate the landlord class. And no, that doesn't automatically mean mass executions, PragerU. I'm sorry to rain on your parade. Liquidating a class can be, and most often is, as simple as making it illegal to own a property that you don't live in. Boom, landlords stop existing literally overnight. Notice, in my analysis of that contradiction, I was able to acknowledge the actual mechanical reason why landlords act the way they do. Yes, they are terrible people, and I firmly believe that they should feel terrible. But I don't advocate for landlording to be abolished because I don't like them. I advocate for that policy because it is the correct and only way to permanently resolve the contradiction that exists between landlords and tenants. This is what Mao means in the next section when he says, "In studying a problem, we must shun subjectivity, one-sidedness, and superficiality. To be subjective means not to look at problems objectively, that is, not to use the materialist viewpoint in looking at problems. For example, to understand only China but not Japan, only the Communist Party but not the Kuomintang, only the proletariat but not the bourgeoisie, only the peasants but not the landlords, only the favorable conditions but not the difficult ones, only the past but not the future, only individual parts but not the whole, only the defects but not the achievements, only the plaintiff's case but not the defendant's, only underground revolutionary work but not open revolutionary work," and so on. In a phrase, it means not to understand the characteristics of both aspects of a contradiction. When one analyzes a contradiction from only their own perspective, they're led to conclusions that are not only simplistic and morally charged, but also literally less accurate. This, while maybe feeling more emotionally satisfying, makes it more difficult and often straight up impossible to resolve these contradictions. As good as it may feel to say, landlords are bad people and do things because they're bad, it doesn't allow you to stop them from existing. Mao presents a Lenin quote that he felt encapsulates the whole idea. In order really to know an object, we must embrace, study all its sides, all connections and mediations. We shall never achieve this completely, but the demand for all-sidedness is a safeguard against mistakes and rigidity. Tying all of this back into the first section, you can think of a subjective, one-sided analysis as one formed on essentially the metaphysical world outlook, one that acknowledges only one side of each contradiction, and looks for external rather than internal causes. Instead, as we've already covered, we should be looking for internal causes, the fundamental contradiction within a given system, to actually move from one stage to the next, and it does happen in stages. To illustrate this, Mao gives the following example. For instance, when the capitalism of the era of free competition developed into imperialism, there was no change in the class nature of the two classes in fundamental contradiction, namely the working class and the owning class, or in the capitalist essence of society. However, the contradiction between those two classes became intensified. The contradiction between monopoly and non-monopoly capital emerged. The contradiction between the colonial powers and the colonies deepened. The contradiction among the capitalist countries resulting from their uneven development manifested itself with particular sharpness, and thus there arose a special stage of capitalism, the stage of imperialism. Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism, and proletarian revolution precisely because Lenin and Stalin have correctly explained these contradictions and correctly formulated the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution for their resolution. Just as a quick side note here, this is what most communists mean when they say they're Marxist-Leninists or Marxist-Leninist Maoists. They believe that whatever floating head they're mentioning advocated for the correct way to update and reapply communist theory in a specific stage of the class struggle. Leninism in the stage of anti-imperialist struggle, Maoism in the stage of decolonial struggle. It's still a gray area though, so if it's important, it's still worth asking them what they mean. Anyways, stages of revolution. Mao discusses the stages of revolution as they played out in the Chinese Revolution. First, the united front of the CCP and the Kuomintang against the imperialists, in which they both allied with the USSR USSR and fought for the liberation of China from imperial Western control. Then, once the imperialists have been driven out, when the Kuomintang turned on the CCP and started working with the Nazis and other reactionaries to drive out the communists. Finally, the stage that China was in during World War II, when the Kuomintang turned around once more to ally with the communists against the now invading Japanese. Each one of these stages was determined by the primary contradiction at the time. In the first stage, the capitalist Kuomintang and communists were able to unite against the imperialists in a war of national liberation. Then, when the threat was defeated, the main contradiction had changed, and now the central conflict was between the Kuomintang and the CCP for the control of China. That is, until the primary contradiction was changed again by the invasion of the Japanese, when the Kuomintang and the CCP again allied together and conducted a war of national liberation against the Japanese. Mao doesn't present these stages as a template for how all revolutions go, because it was certainly unique in the way that it played out, but instead to point out that the fundamental contradiction of a given system can and does change due to outside circumstances, and in order to resolve that contradiction, new tactics must be used. Different problems require different solutions. Now we've talked about all sorts of particularities, as Mao calls them. Aspect of contradictions, fundamental contradictions, stages of revolution. It's also individual, and we've just talked about how each system needs to be analyzed on its own. But in the last section, we talked a bunch about how generalizations can be made. How does that work? Well, once a situation has been analyzed on a case-by-case basis, then it can be compared to others, and through that contrast, general rules or commonalities can be found. While the stages of revolution in the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution were both very different, when comparing them we can see that there was a point at which imperial powers, Europe, the US, and Japan, not only supported pro-capitalist factions during the revolution, but in fact put their own boots on the ground to crush the communists, and failed miserably. Because this has been observed multiple times, it's safe to say that imperial powers are likely to get involved in any impending communist revolution on the side of the anti-communists. Mao puts it like this: since the particular is united with the universal, and since the universality as well as the particularity of contradiction is inherent in everything, we should, when studying an object, try to discover both the particular and the universal, and their interconnection, to discover both particularity and universality, and also their interconnection within the object itself, and to discover the interconnections of this object with the many objects outside it. Mao praises Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism as a great example of this process at play, a book I have no doubt we will cover at some point, but I encourage you to get a jump start on it. There's a link in the description. Anyways, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. Now, we've talked about contradiction a lot, and we've talked about how complicated specific relationships within contradictions can be, and we've even talked about how complicated the relationship between singular contradictions and generalizations is. But one thing we haven't touched on is the relationship between contradictions themselves. That's what we're looking at in this section. You see, while there's always one main contradiction that structures a given situation, like the contradiction between workers and owners structures capitalism, there's also always other smaller, less influential contradictions too, like the contradiction between owners and the remains of the feudal aristocracy, the kings and the queens. Yes, they've mostly been brought into the same class after the liberal revolutions of the last few centuries, but the process wasn't 100%, and they still have slightly different interests. The term to distinguish these two contradictions, the one between workers and owners versus the one between business owners and kings, is principal contradiction. That is, under capitalism, the contradiction between workers and owners is the principal contradiction, and the other is a secondary contradiction. Looking back at the way the Chinese Revolution played out, we can see the reason that the Kuomintang stabbed the communists in the back and then unstabbed them and then re-stabbed them was because the principal contradiction had changed. When they were fighting against the remnants of the Qing dynasty, the principal contradiction was the emperor versus everyone else. Then, when that was resolved by the destruction of the Qing dynasty, the principal contradiction was then workers versus owners. Then, when Japan started invading China during World War II, the principal contradiction changed again to the Japanese invaders versus the native Chinese. Then, after World War II, the principal contradiction changed one last time, back to the contradiction between workers and owners. Now, this confused me. The fundamental contradiction is the contradiction that determines the mode of production a society exists in, workers versus capitalists, while a principal contradiction is the most influential at the time. China, when it was being invaded by Japan, had the capitalist fundamental contradiction, i.e. workers versus capitalists, but the principal contradiction was the invaders versus the native population. The principal contradiction changes between stages of a given contradiction, while the fundamental contradiction only changes when the contradiction itself is resolved. Make sense? If not, ask your questions in the comments. I'll be in there to help. What can complicate this even more is when the principal contradiction changes position in relation to the class structure of a given society. Basically, sometimes outside forces, classes, i.e. imperialism, can actually ally with some classes within a country in order to maintain domination. This is the case with all of the US's current neo-colonial holdings, especially in Africa and West Asia. The very upper crust of society is thrown some bones by their imperial overlords, so they'll turn on their neighbors and help the imperialists oppress their own people. That changes the principal contradiction from one of invaders versus the native population to one of invaders and their collaborators versus the native working class. Another example of this shifting of class position can be seen when revolutions are successful in resolving the principal contradiction. For example, when the Soviets resolved their fundamental contradiction in 1917, the imperialist forces didn't just give up and walk away. No, they landed troops in Siberia and tried to overturn the revolution. That obviously failed, and so the next time a revolution was successful, in China, they tried a different tack, attempting to split the revolutionaries internally, and that was successful, hence the aforementioned stabbing in the back that the Kuomintang did to the communists. But their broader goal of reversing the gains of the revolution was not, because the CCP anticipated this change and was able to effectively counter it. But whatever class position the principal contradiction occupies, there's always one single principal contradiction that is at play in any given stage. Similarly, as we mentioned earlier, the two contradictory aspects of a contradiction are also not the same. One of the two usually plays a principal role. For example, the owning class in the example of the contradiction between workers and owners. The nature of the contradiction is largely determined by what benefits the principal aspect of a contradiction, or which of the two has the high ground in the struggle at that time. But as with all things in Mao's dialectics, that situation is not static. The aspects can transform themselves into each other when the contradiction progresses from one stage to the next. When contradictions heighten and socialist revolution emerges on the horizon of the class struggle, the working class then takes the dominant position, becoming the principal aspect for that stage of the contradiction. Over the centuries-long march of history, this results in a pattern of the newer aspect of a given contradiction gaining dominance over the other, which eventually withers away and dies out. Then, once the principal aspect has effectively killed off its predecessor, the nature of the contradiction shifts, and a new secondary aspect emerges in contradiction to that new principal aspect. Again, think of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Kings were originally the principal aspect, and through the course of their contradiction, or struggle, with the emerging capitalist class, they were eventually subordinated to the position of the secondary aspect. As this occurred, the capitalist class gained their position as the principal aspect of the contradiction, and a new secondary aspect, workers, emerged to challenge the capitalists. Through the gradual process of one aspect gaining dominance, it ended its predecessor, created the conditions for the emergence of its eventual successor, and also changed the nature of the contradiction to such a degree that we refer to them as separate forms of social organization. At this point, Mao takes this complex theoretical framework that we've been describing and applies it to the real world. Say, for the sake of argument, you existed in a scenario where the revolutionary struggle had all but been defeated, with socialist states either dissolved or reduced to a subordinate role in geopolitics. Say, the vast majority of workers in the world, due to a diet of propaganda shoveled down their throats since birth, either didn't know of or outright despised the revolutionary science of Marxism. The bleak capitalist hell of a reality you're born into stands in stark contrast to the proud revolutionary utopia found in Marxist theory. They contradict each other, you might say. What are you to do? Well, Mao says, at certain times in the revolutionary struggle, the difficulties outweigh the favorable conditions, and so constitute the principal aspect of the contradiction, and the favorable conditions constitute the secondary aspect. But through their efforts, the revolutionaries can overcome the difficulties step by step and open up a favorable new situation. Thus, a difficult situation yields a favorable one. This is what happened after the failure of the revolution in China in 1927, and during the long march of the Chinese Red Army. In the present Sino-Japanese War, China is again in a difficult position, but we can change this and fundamentally transform the situation as between China and Japan. Engaging in the revolutionary struggle in any way you can, whether it be by organizing politically, creating mutual aid networks, talking to your friends about politics, or even just sitting at work learning about the revolutionary science of Marxism while you eat a hoagie on your lunch break. All of it, in its own small way, helps to build the more favorable conditions for revolution, slowly but surely allowing that revolutionary new world to claw itself up from its place as the secondary aspect in the contradiction and take its place as the principal aspect of the contradiction. Then, once it has done so, it can build a new contradiction, progressing to the next stage of revolution, where the fundamental contradiction of our political and economic system can once more be confronted directly. The same holds true for knowledge. as Mao says. At the very beginning of our study of Marxism, our ignorance of, or scanty acquaintance with Marxism, stands in contradiction to knowledge of Marxism. But by assiduous study, ignorance can be transformed into knowledge, scanty knowledge into substantial knowledge, and blindness in the application of Marxism into mastery of its application. But wait, I thought Marxism was materialist. I thought it was about factories and economies and wages. After all, isn't the material base the primary driving force of dialectics? Well, yes, in general. But like we talked about earlier, the aspects of a contradiction change position from principal to secondary and back again constantly. To deny this is anti-materialist in itself. Mao puts it like this: the creation and advocacy of revolutionary theory plays the principal and decisive role in those times of which Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. When the superstructure, politics, culture, etc., obstructs the development of the economic base, political and cultural changes become principal and decisive. The reason is that while we recognize that in the general development of history, the material determines the mental and social being determines social consciousness, we also, and indeed must, recognize the reaction of the mental on material things, of social consciousness on social being, and of the superstructure on the economic base. If there's one thing that we've learned from this chapter, it's that nothing is static within dialectical materialism. Understanding the concept of a principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction and the variability of those two concepts allows us to articulate, predict, and most importantly, strategize with those changes in mind. Part 5. The identity and struggle of the aspect of a contradiction. So, we talked about the relationship between two aspects of a contradiction, that they're both interdependent and contradictory. But let's zoom in on that a bit and see if we can clarify that anymore. Obviously, both aspects contradict each other. That's why we call it a contradiction. They're always engaged in struggle with one another, which defines the way that they interact with each other. But, and this is the trippy part, they're also so deeply intertwined with each other in a definitional sense that one can't exist without the other. I'll let Mao explain. The fact is that no contradictory aspect can exist in isolation. Without its opposite aspect, each loses the condition for its existence. Just think, can any one contradictory aspect of a thing or of a concept in the human mind exist independently? Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. Without below, there would be no above. Without business owners, there would be no workers. Without workers, there would be no business owners. It is so with all opposites. Under given conditions, on the one hand, they are opposed to each other, and on the other, they are interconnected, interpenetrating, interpermeating, and interdependent. And this character is described as identity. This is what Lenin means when he says that dialectics studies how opposites can be identical, because each is the condition for the other's existence. This is the first meaning of identity. Thanks to this two sides of the same coin nature, weird transformations can take place between these two aspects over time. When one changes position in relation to the other, from secondary to principal aspect, they literally transform into their opposite. Through a socialist revolution, the working class, the ruled class, is transformed into the ruler, and the owning class, the ruling class, is transformed into the ruled. The coin was flipped. Mao puts it like this: under given conditions of having and not having, acquiring and losing, they are interconnected. The two sides have a single identity. Under socialism, private property is transformed into public property. This has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place everywhere else. There is a bridge leading from private property to public property, which in philosophy is called identity, or transformation into each other, or interpenetration. This concept is also the origin of an idea that seems baffling to lay people and ideological anti-communists, that Marxism can advocate for the destruction of the state and coercive power in general by undertaking a socialist revolution that uses coercive power to create an all-powerful state. To consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat is in fact to prepare the conditions for abolishing this dictatorship and advancing to the higher stage when all state systems are eliminated. To establish and build the Communist Party is, in fact, to prepare the conditions for the elimination of the Communist Party and all political parties. Through the interpenetration of opposites, or the identity of a contradiction, whichever crusty philosophical term you prefer, contradictory things are interconnected, and that connection enables one aspect to transform into the other. This is where we loop back to the two world outlooks we outlined earlier. At their cores, the dialectical outlook embraces this concept of interpenetration of opposites, and sees it as the central driving force of development, while the metaphysical outlook denies its very existence. And this is why one is so popular among the progressive, forward-looking, oppressed classes, and the other is so popular among the reactionary, backwards oppressors. If people are aware of the driving force of history, then they can use that to help drive history themselves. If they decide that change comes from the outside, they'll sit back, content to let those at the wheel continue to drive for as long as they want. At this point, Mao is careful to make clear that this identity, or interpenetration of opposites, is only present in certain situations with specific conditions. It's incredibly difficult to speak about this in generalities, but basically, in order for the identity or interpenetration connection to be taken advantage of, the struggle between the two aspects of a contradiction must be at a certain stage, ready for the transformation to take place. While struggle is constant in every contradiction, like we talked about earlier, it manifests in two different forms: quantitative struggle and qualitative struggle. We've talked about the difference between these two before, but the TLDR is an aspect is growing in quantity, like the number of radicalized workers in a given country, or it's growing in quality, like when the revolution actually takes place. It's only during qualitative struggle that the identity transformation can take place. In plain English, the radical transformation of capitalism into socialism does not come about simply from all the workers in a given society being radicalized. Socialism comes about through revolution, waged in the sudden war against capitalism, and through the process of revolution, the quality of society is changed, moving through the identity connection between the two sides of that contradiction's coin, from one that is ruled by capitalists to one that is ruled by workers. In this way, the struggle between two aspects of a contradiction is constant, but the identity is something that only comes to play in the specific, transitory, relative, and conditional circumstances. Mao ties a nice neat bow on this section by explaining a proverb. We Chinese often say, things that oppose each other also complement each other. That is, things opposed to each other have identity, are identical to one another. This saying is dialectical and contrary to metaphysics. Oppose each other refers to the mutual exclusion or the struggle of two contradictory aspects. Complement each other means that, in given conditions, the two contradictory aspects unite and achieve identity. Yet struggle is inherent in identity, and without struggle there can be no identity. Part 6. The place of antagonism in contradiction. Now, we've spilled a lot of ink talking about contradictions, and we've also specifically mentioned how they are founded on a constant struggle between the two aspects of contradiction, and we've given the example of a whole lot of violins in revolution. But that doesn't mean that struggle between the two aspects is always a violin, or, in Mao's words, contradiction is not always antagonistic. To illustrate this, we don't even have to look very far. In our current situation right now, in the West at least, there is clearly a contradiction and struggle between workers and owners. And I don't know about you, but I haven't started a guerrilla war against my employer. The contradiction and the struggle have not yet progressed to the stage of antagonism. Mao gives the example of a bomb. Before it explodes, a bomb is a single entity in which opposites coexist under given conditions. The explosion takes place only when a new condition, ignition, is present. An analogous situation arises in all of those natural phenomena which finally assume the form of open conflict to resolve old contradictions and produce new things. It's important to acknowledge this, because depending on the specific contradiction in question, the solution could be wildly different depending on whether or not it is in an antagonistic stage. It is also important to note that because antagonism is a stage of struggle, given contradictions can enter and leave an antagonistic stage, depending on material circumstances. To illustrate this, Mao gives the example of a struggle between the factions of a single communist party. During the 1917 revolution, the contradiction between Trotsky and Lenin was not antagonistic, but once the Communist Party became the ruling body of the USSR, it became antagonistic, and the contradiction was then resolved through violins. Mao is also careful to mention that the resolution of intra-party contradictions can be, and indeed it is better if they are, resolved during periods of non-antagonistic contradiction. It's better for the party if those with incorrect ideas are corrected before those incorrect ideas erupt into violins. To quote Lenin, antagonism and contradiction are not at all one and the same. That is to say, antagonism is one form, but not the only form of the struggle of opposites. The formula of antagonism cannot be arbitrarily applied everywhere. Part 7. Conclusion. To sum everything up, the dialectical materialist worldview is defined by the law of contradiction and the law of the unity of opposites. These two laws are observable at a fundamental level in the development of nature, society, and human knowledge. It also stands in opposition to the old business owner way of thinking, called the metaphysical worldview. Each contradiction has its own unique characteristics, and depending on what it is compared to, can look different from different angles. In a few phrases, these are the particularity and relativity of contradiction, respectively. Each contradiction can also be further divided into two aspects, between which there is a fundamental relationship that is defined by two characteristics. The first is a constant, ceaseless struggle between both aspects. The second is the ability for the aspects to transform into one another when put in a very specific situation. This ability is referred to somewhat confusingly as identity. Importantly, while identity identity depends on specific circumstances, struggle is ongoing, both before, during, and after the transformation facilitated by identity takes place. Some contradictions are more influential to the world around them than others, and those that are most influential in a certain context are referred to as the principal contradiction. Similarly, within each contradiction, one of the two aspects is usually in a more influential position than the other, and that more dominant aspect is referred to as the principal aspect of a contradiction. Finally, it is also important to recognize that contradictions go through temporal stages, and that in passing from one stage to another, the principal aspect of the contradiction can change. Some stages are also characterized by outright violent conflict, and those stages are referred to as antagonistic. Those that are not are referred to as non-antagonistic, and that quality can change independently of any of the other aforementioned qualities depending on material circumstances. That was probably the densest script I've ever written. Please, if you made it this far and there's anything that is not clear or you think could be better put another way, drop it in the comments. The point of this video is to make things clearer, and I did my best, but I can't answer questions I haven't heard. Other than that, I highly recommend you read this chapter itself. It's linked in the description. If not to make things clearer, then simply to appreciate Mao's prose. Despite the fact that this has been translated through at least one language I don't speak, it's impossible to deny how clear, concise, and frankly poetic his writing is. And this chapter is a fantastic example of that. Anyways, I'll see you next time. Be sure to keep it radical.
If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud. Preach. Lastly, but most importantly, the views expressed in this video are solely those of the book's author, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the video creator. It has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.